the approach that you took, if I remember, was to come up to P.Z. Myers with a movie camera and ask him why he hated Muslims. When in fact, the reality is that we don't hate Muslims. We hate religion, if we hate anything at all, and only because religion lies to people and we hate lies. And that's what it's all about. That's what apologetics is all about. It's lies and misrepresentation. We don't stomach that. We don't want opinions where you can disagree or you can agree. No. Well, I want cold, hard facts where I have to be compelled to believe in it whether I want to or not. And that's what I have to present to you. When you talk about how could people have understood these things way back when we already know, as P.Z. Myers pointed out to you, and he was later vindicated, I'm sure, that the Quran borrowed from Aristotle and from Galen, and then you brought up, as soon as you realized that P.Z. Myers was an embryologist and understood what he talked about, you immediately wanted to change it to geology. Well, I was a geology major. Okay, so let's go to geology. You said that isostasis was in the Quran. How could they know that mountains have roots in them and that their purpose is to stop earthquakes? When in fact, the Quran describes the world as being spread out by a map, and mountains are dropped on top of it like carpet pegs, or more appropriately, like paperweights. When the reality is that isostasis means that mountains float in the lithosphere much the same way that icebergs float in the ocean, and the world does move underneath them. Tectonic plates move underneath the mountains, and they move the mountains. And so that analogy was completely wrong. So then you were asked, why is it that Muhammad was wrong while you were asking, how could he have known these great truths? He didn't know any great truths. The book was wrong. The interpretation was wrong. The assumption was wrong.
Okay, to respond to that, essentially the first thing about the copying of Aristotle, there is absolutely no convincing historical evidence that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing upon him, actually copied from Aristotle. I actually went to the library and I read...
Would you like me to read the evidence that does? I probably should just refer you to the video. The last caller that was just on did a video where he shows this particular passage and a number of others from Galen, and also refers to the scholars that were trained in Hellenic science in Persia, who were then assigned to Muhammad either by the Shah or I forget where the other one came. Oh yeah, it was the local physician who was trained himself in Persia, and then had Muhammad refer people to him. So it was obviously very familiar with people that were versed in Hellenic science. And Aristotle was writing this in 350 BC. That was 1,000 years before the Quran. So how could you not say, since they say identical things, that one did not borrow from the other? One was well known for a millennia before the other was wrote down. The Quran came second. The Quran adopted knowledge already widely held throughout the civilized world. It's not that the Quran is inimitable, it is that the Quran is an imitation.
No, first and foremost, Aristotle, what did he say about how babies are formed? He said it was the semen mixed with the menstrual blood. Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
He followed the same patterns as the Quran, which, by the way,
the Quran doesn't say that.
Wrong.
That's the whole point. The Quran doesn't say that semen.
The Quran doesn't say that the human starts as seminal fluid, ignoring completely the importance of the female ovum, which the authors of the Quran obviously didn't know anything about.
I have a
change, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the seminal fluid without a female ovum then turns into a clot of blood, which it isn't, and then becomes a skeleton, which it doesn't. And then the skeleton, subsequently, not simultaneously, is then closed in flesh. Whereas Adnan, your associate, wanted to say that it was happening at the same time, if the situation demands that you say it happens at the same time. There's never a point, though, where you can say, you know what, you're right. There's never a point where you can say, that's correct, this was an error, this needs to be corrected. Why? Because of something you said earlier today. It's a priori. I don't have a priori positions. That's the principal difference between us. I can be wrong, and if I am wrong, I want to know that I'm wrong. You have an a priori position. You cannot admit that you're wrong. And your cultural situation is much worse than mine, because I can admit that I'm wrong, and I will only gain more respect for admitting that I'm wrong. You may suffer a death sentence.
Well, not in England.
Oh, not in England,
Yeah, obviously.
but somewhere else you might do.
Well, unless you go where the EDL live. Anyway.
So, okay, so would it not have been possible for the author of this particular passage to have clarified so that we don't have to have this argument, so that Islam wouldn't have to endure the embarrassment of this ambiguity in this passage? Could this not have been improved?
No, because that presumes that the Quran came here to teach us about physics, cosmology, science. It didn't. It came here to give us...
Truth, fact, reality. Yes, those things matter.
But let me ask you a question. If you really know... This is an existential question, right?
No, it's not. That's the
Well,
whole point.
I
This
think
is not an existential question. This is a matter of fact.
Okay.
You either say something that
Let me
is
tell
true,
you matter of fact.
or say something that is not true.
The matter of
And if
fact...
you can... Go ahead.
The matter of fact to me, when I want to go to science, I'll learn about science and I'll become a scientist and I'll basically explore the universe, and many Muslims in this country are physicists, they're cosmologists, etc. Now, when we go to the Quran, we say, the first premise is that the Quran doesn't deny reality. It didn't here to explain fully physical reality in every single stage and every single specific instance. So the Quran is a book of signs, not a book of science. So it gives the value structure and the motivation and drive to worship God, to treat humanity in the best possible manner, to establish justice, etc., etc., etc. So to now assume that this book has to now tell us all the specific details, it's irrelevant.
Any. I'll take any. I don't need all. I just need any.
But Hamza, the problem,
hold on, Deep Dark, please.
Wait, Aaron. The problem is,
You still need to make...
I'm sorry, Hamza, if I may. I do apologise. If I may. The fact is that you previously have stated that the Quran was inspired and did contain scientific knowledge. And now, when that knowledge that you claim exists is being examined, you seem to have shifted your position, and it has now been, well, that's not what the book was about. So, which is it? Does the Quran contain any scientific knowledge at all, or not?
No, you have to understand what I said before. I said, and I did say, I retract my position the way I came across with Professor Myers, that all the specifics are in the Quran, which is not true, right? The underlying premise that I follow is the classical tradition, and the classical tradition says that the Quran doesn't deny reality. Now, this sounds like so what we're saying, it doesn't deny reality.
You were asked specifically by Aaron to quote something from the Quran that gave us an idea of scientific foreknowledge, and I'm sorry, as yet, you have not done so. But I'll give you time to think about it. Okay.
When we were talking about isostasy before, I mean, you were going on the embryology thing, and you said there's two different interpretations possible. The isostasy is not that way.
Sure.
Right. So the interpretation given for how they could have come up with this conclusion that you subsequently derived and certainly could not have read in prior to the discovery of plate tectonics, you accept now that your arguments for isostasy were incorrect.
Yeah. Well, in light of what you said, I think my interpretation is probably an inaccurate interpretation, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Again, if we're looking for something that is going to imply some kind of impetus to believe, it needs to be verifiable. Now, when I mentioned that the reason that I did not believe the Quran was because it's based on Bronze Age mythology of things we know did not happen. Your associate Adnan tried to tell me that the flood, the Great Flood, was not in the Quran, and then he did a subsequent video in which he's clarified that there's a flood in there, but it wasn't the Great Flood.
Yes.
Yeah. Have you corrected him on that?
Well, he corrected himself. He said it wasn't a Great Flood in the first place anyway. He said it's a local flood. He said it was a local flood.
A local flood.
Yeah.
From which there were waves the size of mountains, and where you had to have two of every kind, and where there would be no survivors even on the highest mountains, and where every unbeliever was going to be killed, and that the survivors would all be descended from Noah. But it's only a local flood.
because the argument is that civilization at that time, because the time between Adam and Noah was relatively short, and we're saying the civilization was local, it wasn't global. That's the argument here.
Waves the size of mountains,
That's
and two of every kind.
Well, it's
And
like
it also says that the ark was deposited on top of a mountain when the flood subsided.
Yes.
A local flood did that?
Well, a local flood, what we're saying, for example, the tsunami, you could have huge waves, for instance, and instead of local flood, it doesn't become global, does it?
Okay, I don't mean to come across as churlish, but I
That's
think
fine.
you need to brush up on your hydrodynamics. I don't think that any local flood that remains local could deposit a ship of that size on top of a mountain. I mean, okay, there's a gentleman on YouTube who replicated. He's a Christian scholar, and he replicated Noah's flood in his backyard using only a garden hose. And I really think that you ought to get together with him and compare notes.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, but see, this is the interesting thing. See, you're forgetting a reality here that, you see, if it's an act of God, then essentially from a ontological perspective, we would say that this is possible. Do you see?
No, it's not
can
possible.
basically do anything.
That's
what is
the
argument.
problem.
There's magic. Aaron, you're just going to have to accept that he believes in magic, and you don't. I think
And
this is really, we're going around in circles.
Now, you may say that there isn't fine-tuning based upon what you just spoke about, but let's take, for instance, the strong nuclear force. The value is 0.007. If it was 0.006...
In what units?
Sorry?
What units?
I don't have the units. This is a quote from...
You've just got a figure and you don't know what units it is.
No, I don't.
Right. Can you also explain this for me, please?
Sure.
How does gravity affect life? Can life exist without gravity, for example?
Yeah, I assume so.
Right. So it's not highly... Your argument's just crumbled, hasn't it?
How has it?
Because the gravitational constant is not necessary for life, and you don't even know what units you're referring to. So I'm sorry. The argument really does sound very implausible.
DPR, may I interject something? Okay, when you're talking about if gravity were different, okay, for example, on Earth, the gravity is 9.81 meters per second squared. On the Moon, it's 1.62 meters per second squared. Venus, it's 8.8. Mars, it's 3.7. But on all of these bodies, gravity still works. So if the gravitational constant were changed, all of these values would have been changed accordingly. But there's no reason to believe that the train just runs completely off the track. There's no way we could know that that would happen. If things were different, they would be different. But that doesn't mean that we wouldn't have a valid physical universe.
Yeah, and I probably should bring up something else since you're mentioning gravity.
Sorry. You may have a valid physical universe, but would you have a universe that could permit life? Because the range of values are very small here. And the thing is...
I'm sorry, before you proceed with this argument, you're talking about things which you clearly do not understand. You're talking about a number, and you can't even put the unit on what the force of what this force is. How do you expect to be taken credibly?
Okay, see, I don't claim... Okay, I'll give you an example. Could you answer, for example, how a statistician would actually calculate the probabilities of the fine-tuning? I couldn't do that. I don't claim to do that. I'm actually standing on the shoulders of a giant.
I've seen people do that, yes.
Yeah, I know. So have I.
But it's not a difficult thing to fudge.
It doesn't claim... So what I'm trying to say is, I'm not claiming that I'm a physicist. Nowhere near. All I'm saying is this. If premise number one is true, if there is fine-tuning, for example, we read the works...
And we've already established that premise number one is not true.
Well, I would argue if you read a basic college physics textbook, you could even find a page with some of these constants on there. I was trying to do that.
Unfortunately, you have not, because you don't even know what units you're referring to.
Hold on.
Most impressive speech, my friend Hamza.
Thank you.
I'm a little puzzled though. Why was it that you needed to bring science into making religion appear authentic? I heard you talk about M theory. I heard you talking about gravity. I heard you talking about Stephen Hawking. These are probably things that you don't do for a living, but I do something pretty close to that. I frankly didn't quite see the need for your bringing in these things. Yeah. What you have insisted upon is somehow bringing science into this, using words like the data and cosmology show. Well, my dear chap, if I was to ask you to write down Einstein's equation for the expanding universe, I bet you wouldn't be able to do it. Would you?
You could try me.
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I can't do it.
Oh, yeah. Because all this is stuff that you've read in popular science books. And you don't know these things. You think you do because you've read popular accounts. So please don't go outside of your field of expertise and hang important theological issues onto, I'd say, popular level knowledge. Or rather, the only way out, and that's the one provided by Sayyid Ahmad Khan, is that you say the Quran is correct, science is correct, but you have to read the Quran in a way so that the possibility of miracles becomes allegorical. And you see, that's the sort of difficulty that people like HAMZA avoid. All they do is talk about things about which they have half-baked knowledge. M theory. Now, if I was to ask you what is M theory, boy, I'd get a blank, I think. Unless you'd care to write down what it's all about. How can you do something like that without knowing what it is? How can you talk about Big Bang cosmology without being able to write down Einstein's field equations?